Last Sunday in our gospel, we saw that Jesus was put to the test. A Pharisee brought up this question: what is the most important of all the commandments? And we saw that Jesus responded, saying that the most important commandment is to love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. And the second one was loving your neighbor. In today's readings, in the first reading and also in the gospel, we will see a widow appearing. And I think that if we find the common ground between the two widows, we will see that the great message of this Sunday is a message of generosity. And I think that it would be useful for us to think today deeply about generosity and to see what can we learn about the generosity of the widows, and perhaps even do an examination of conscience or on our own generosity. And I think there are 3 lessons that we could take from the generosity of the widows. The first thing that we see is that true generosity hurts. False generosity doesn't hurt. False generosity is when you have surplus and when you give from everything that you have. But true generosity hurts because it means taking away from what small you have. I'm going to give you a silly example, but perhaps this can help us understand. I remember when I was a schoolboy, I took my lunchbox to school. And there were days when my lunchbox was great and amazing, and I had plenty in my lunchbox. People in my house were generous with me some days. Another days, maybe, they were late doing the groceries. So the lunchbox was a little bit more austere, poor. It was easy to share your lunchbox when your lunchbox was grandeur, right? You were giving away cookies to everyone. But the day that your lunchbox was miserable and someone asked you to have something from your lunchbox, that was very different. So the first lesson is generosity hurts. You're not being generous when you give and it doesn't hurt. You're just giving of your surplus. You're truly being generous when giving takes away from what you are, from something that's really necessary to you. And if you look closely at the readings, both widows did a painful sacrifice. The first one, she had almost no oil and no flour left. She had a very miserable lunchbox. And Elijah said, "Give me everything that you have. Prepare, something for me with your flour and with your oil." And the second widow also gave of what little she had. So the first lesson is true generosity always hurts. So this also brings up the question: are you generous to a place where it hurts? Or are you generous only with what you have to spare in a way that it doesn't make really uncomfortable giving out? Are you generous with your time in a way that it hurts? Or do you only give your time when you have plenty to spare, without ever hurting yourself in your sleep time or in your own recreation? The second lesson about generosity from the widows today is that generosity transforms the person who gives. Let me repeat this. Generosity transforms the person who gives. If you are truly generous in giving, you're not the same person before giving that after giving. Something changes in you because you give up something of yourself and you're not the same person. A generous person is transformed by his gift or his sacrifice. And I want to share with you a beautiful example from my own life. When I was in Peru, I met a man who was from Italy, and he lived in the mountains working and serving the poor with his family. He had married an Italian woman and they had 6 kids. And they were in a lost place in the Andes Mountains in Peru. And I said, how did you get here? Why did you choose moving from Italy, such a beautiful place, to a beautiful place in the Andes Mountains too, but certainly much more poor? And he told me this beautiful story. He said, when I was a teenager, someone in my parish invited me to work for a poor one afternoon. They said, come work for the poor. And this was the catch. You came on a Saturday afternoon, you put in manual labor, and the wage that you were meant to be paid, you gave up on that wage, and that wage was sent to a third world country. And he said, I went the first Saturday, and I really liked giving my time for the poor, working for the poor. So I came back the next Saturday, and the next Saturday, until someone invited me and said, why don't you offer 1 year of your life and go work for the poor in Peru? Instead of just coming on Saturdays, why don't you take a step further in generosity and go and work for 1 year in Peru for free for the poor? And he said, I came to Peru for 1 year, and I decided to stay for my whole life. So what happened in the life of this person? The first day he went to work and he was generous, he wasn't the same person before he came to work and when he left to work for the poor. The first year, he wasn't the same person who came in to work, the person who came out after working 1 year for the poor. So what you see is that generosity, true generosity, transforms the person who gives. So let me ask you this question. Are you generous enough that your generosity is transforming you? Is it true that your generosity, because you sacrifice something of yourself, is making you someone different and better? Or is your generosity so small that it cannot transform who you are? And the last point about generosity that I think is the most beautiful point is that those who are generous with God get to experience God's generosity. Let me repeat this. Only those who are truly generous with God can perceive God's generosity. Let me give you the example from the first reading. The widow did a painful sacrifice. She had little oil, little flour. She gave everything. It really hurt. But what did she gain? She experienced the generosity of God. What did the text say? For a whole year, the oil and the flour never run out. So the beautiful experience of generosity is the more generous you are, the more you get to experience the generosity of God. So I want to finish with one story. And this has to do with my own institution, Pro Ecclesia Santa, and its beginnings. Our institution began in the worst possible scenario. It was the 80s in Peru. And during the 80s, Peru faced the worst hyperinflation in the history of our country, and our hyperinflation was so bad that it was only surpassed by the hyperinflation in Germany after the First World War. In Peru, money was worth nothing. In Peru in the 80s, we had also the problem of terrorism. So there were radical communist groups who were planning on taking over the government through terrorist acts. Why am I sharing all of this? Because in the midst of a profound civil crisis and economical crisis, the two first members of PS generously gave up on their lives to follow Christ. They had nothing. They told me that when they started, they weren't homeless, but they were close to being homeless. But you know what they told me? That in that situation of generosity is where they could see more clearly the generosity of God. They never lacked anything. Although they didn't have to spare, they certainly had always something to eat. and what they needed for subsistence. So what's the last lesson? Only when you are truly generous, you can experience God's generosity in your life. Only when you put all into God, you can see how generous God can be with you. So this also begs the question, are you generous enough in your life that you can experience the generosity of God? Are you generous enough with your money, with your finances, that you can truly experience the generosity of God in your own life? Are you generous with your time in a way that you can experience God's generosity? So remember, brothers and sisters, let us learn from the widows. Number one, true generosity hurts. You don't give from what you have to spare. You give from your own, from what hurts. Second, the person that's truly generous with his gift or with her gift becomes transformed like this Italian man. Because every time that you give yourself and you become a new person in giving. And last but not least, only those who are truly generous, they get to experience God's generosity in their own life. So my encouragement for you is this week, if God gives you the chance to be generous, even in a way that hurts, choose to be generous so you get to experience God's generosity in your own life.